Welcome to That's Inclusive, where we talk about disability and what it means to live a full life engaging in our communities. What does that look like, and how can we work together to make our world a more inclusive place? Hi, everybody. Welcome to That's Inclusive, where we talk about community living for people with disabilities. And today we have a very special guest, James Ziegra. He is an attorney at the Disability Rights Center, New Hampshire, and he is our go-to for voting rights and voting accessibility. And we also have Chase Eagleson, who is the project assistant. He's the policy assistant, hopefully soon to be the project assistant, at the DD Council. And he just finished writing a paper that is a call for an audit for voting accessibility. And we're happy to have James here today to talk to us about voting accessibility here in New Hampshire, what we have that is working, and what we need to do to make voting more accessible.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
All right, let's jump right into it. So I think it's important to start with just kind of talking about the history of all this. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the history of voting accessibility in the Grand State?
So it dates back to the Rehabilitation Act of the 1970s, and then in 1984, the United States Congress passed the Voting Accessibility for Elderly and Handicapped Act, and that essentially gave people the right to have somebody come into the polling place with them, have an assistant. As long as it wasn't a boss or a union representative, they could have anybody that they wanted. Before that, a lot of times they were disenfranchised from voting. The big game changer came after the 2000 election, and that was with the Help America Vote Act, also known as HAVA. That gave people a private and independent right to vote accessibly, and it came with a lot of money attached, too. So Congress basically said that we want to make sure that we can reduce as many barriers to accessibility in voting as possible, and they passed the Help America Votes Act, so all 50 states and territories got money to help reduce barriers that were preventing people with disabilities from voting. In New Hampshire, and the neat thing about HAVA is that every state got to sort of spend the money as they wanted to. So in New Hampshire, what we did at first was develop a phone fax system where somebody would go into a polling place, they'd talk on a fax machine and a phone, and the ballot would come faxed out to them, and they'd turn that in. There were a lot of problems with that in terms of accessibility because they would have to disclose who they were voting for to the person on the other end of the line that was filling out the ballot for them. But the people at the polling place didn't know how they were voting. So that got scrapped, and in 2016, the state of New Hampshire introduced what's called the One for All system, which is an accessible voting system. It's a ballot marking system. It's basically a tablet computer that has a keyboard, headphones, microphone, and a printer. And it's designed to eliminate barriers for people who are blind or vision impaired because, as you can imagine, if you're blind, if somebody hands you a paper ballot, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. You're not going to be able to fill it out by yourself. So the One for All system introduced in 2016, when it first came out, wasn't that great. There were a lot of problems with the synthetic voice, pronouncing the names of candidates correctly. So our office, and in conjunction with other voting rights advocates, worked with the Secretary of State's office to increase the quality of the synthetic voice. They redid the programming, and they vend out the software now to, I think it's Democracy Live, who programs the ballots, and the experience is a lot better than it was before. It's still not perfect because there's no way for people who are blind or have vision impairments to physically verify their ballot. So they select their choices using a keyboard with hand controls, and when they're done voting, it prints out on the same ballot that everybody else uses. The problem is that there's no way for them to look at that and verify that the printer selected the right candidates for them. We found that it's pretty accurate most of the time if it's set up correctly. That's a big caveat that I'm sure we'll talk about later. But it's come a long way. And then the last piece of accessible voting in New Hampshire happened to coincide with the 2020 pandemic. As everybody knows, there was a lot of fear about voting in person and gathering in big crowds, and so the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General waived the requirement normally you have to have an excuse to vote absentee in New Hampshire, but in 2020, they said, you know what, anybody who wants to vote absentee can vote absentee, which is great. But again, it's an absentee ballot. It's a piece of paper. And if you're blind or you have a vision disability or a print disability and you're not able to mark a piece of paper by, independently, it doesn't do you much good to be mailed a piece of paper. So the Secretary of State's office implemented a new system that allows people with print disabilities, as long as they have sign an affidavit that says that they, have a print disability and they can't complete a ballot on a piece of paper. They can submit that, and then they're emailed the ballot. They can fill it out digitally on a computer with a screen reader like JAWS or something like that, and then they have to print out that piece of paper and mail it back in. So it's not perfectly accessible because there's no electronic return. I think a couple states around the country have that, but the technology is really not there yet in the eyes of the Secretary of State's office.
Yeah, in discussions we've had before about this, especially the one-for-all machine, and also discussions that Vanessa and I had with polling moderators, we've talked about how the one-for-all machine, isn't fully accessible, which means it's not accessible, and how a big part of that is the failure at times to set it up correctly. Could you just talk about, the lack of training around that and why that becomes such an issue?
Sure. How much time you got? We found in almost every instance where there are complaints about issues with the one-for-all, that coincides with a town or city where the moderator or the election officials have not attended the training, or they didn't assemble the one-for-all step-by-step. So the Secretary of State offers a guide that has, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 process that you just follow through, and you have to follow it step by step, individually. If it's not like setting up a TV at home, you have to do it in a certain sequence. And if you don't do it in a certain sequence, things can get kind of wonky. The printer doesn't work right, or sometimes people just don't know how to turn it on. But I think the bottom line is that, for folks that don't attend the training and don't pay attention to the manual that they have been provided, that's where we see a lot of issues. And it can cause people, some significant delays at the polls. I mean, I've heard of people waiting 2+ hours to have the machine set up properly to allow them to vote. And that's a long time for anybody to wait in line to vote, and certainly longer than anybody else in New Hampshire that doesn't have a disability would need to be able to, or would be forced to wait to vote.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard thing. And getting back to those trainings, we've discussed this in the past in our other discussions during my research for the paper.